public policy on Christianity destroy nations? We are not asking that question because we're not trying to prove the affirmative on that question. We don't believe that. We are profiling an article writer for a rag called Plow Magazine. This guy from Missouri, will present him to you shortly, in which he says that although it would be a fantastic idea that more and more people were to follow Christ's dictates, if we were to actually follow Jesus's commandments and put them into public policy, it would actually be destructive to nations. We read the article. We felt as if we needed to comment on the matter because among the things that will become very evident to the audience are not only the internal contradictions of the guy's arguments, but inherently what he actually thinks about Christianity itself. Interestingly enough, this guy calls himself a pastor. Yes, folks, this guy calls himself a pastor, but more on that shortly. Before we continue, we must present who we are to those of you that are new to the channel. My name is Gio. This is my co-host, and I am his, Jesus.
Good evening, friends. So we have a nation that is supposedly founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Talking about this country. I don't know that I agree 100% with the Judeo part of it. But anyway, that's the popular saying. And the point is that it has gone rather well for this country, even though we can't really say, some people argue the opposite, that this is, especially at this point, a Christian nation. Nevertheless, it seems like it was founded on Christian principles, and it's been rather good for the American people. So when you argue that implementing what Jesus taught would actually turn out to be disastrous, that's something that provokes the mind, awakens different thoughts, and we thought we would tackle the issue.
I find this a curious assertion from this individual. Again, we'll profile him shortly in the article as well. When Thomas Jefferson and the founders of the country, especially Thomas Jefferson, he had a lot to say about the Bible, although we do clarify, and for those of you that are history buffs, we know our history with respect to Thomas Jefferson. He was a deist. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. I understand that. Nevertheless, Thomas Jefferson wrote in private that Christ's morals, as that's the terminology that he would use to talk about Jesus' teachings, were the best that the world had ever seen, and it would be rather advantageous for the United States if its citizens, if its people were to adopt said morals and behave in that way. Evidently, folks, even the most deist of deists during the American founding thought that Christianity was good for a nation. Here we have this individual, and I'd like to get into the reading of this article immediately because, look, sometimes in these editions, and I think it's proper for us to do so, we begin to profile the persons whom we are talking about, whom we're criticizing, whom we're commenting on their work or their teachings, because it's important to give you a backdrop of who they are and what they believe, because in many instances, they try to disguise what they are attempting to communicate, what they are attempting to promote. The same applies to this individual. I don't want you to think otherwise. But it's the substance, if we can call it that, of the article that most interests us here. So in case of redeeming the time, I'll just give you the guy's name. His name is Jason G. Edwards. He writes for Plow Magazine, and he's supposedly a pastor in Missouri. I'm going to read excerpts from this article. And my dear co-host, if you see something, if you read something, you hear me say something where you feel like you need to have me pause immediately to comment on that, and there's a lot here.
I shall chime in.
Please do so. Quote, it sounds, well, the name of the article is The Absolute Absurdity of a Christian Nation. So we begin to see that he lays his cards bare on the table. Now, I explain once again, please be understanding in this. This guy uses very mealy-mouthed language. You'll notice that he continues to contradict himself back and forth. There are internal contradictions in this, and he tries to be a wisecrack about it in that the conclusion of the article doesn't fit what people would think is the premise of the article by its title. He's deceitful in that manner, and he would probably say, gotcha. He's not as crafty as he thinks he is.
If I may say something, G, the very fact that articles like this are written then practically defends us in tackling the issue.
Right.
Because some people would say, why are you tackling issues such as this? The article, once again, justifies us tackling the issue because obviously people are consuming stuff like this.
Absolutely.
Believers are consuming this kind of material.
Absolutely. It sounds utopian, a Christian nation, he writes, not a country that hosts prayer breakfast, but one that actually builds its budgets, borders, and public life around the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. One that lets his words, not just about private morality, but also about public justice, shape its systems. We already have a problem. I'm going to interrupt my reading of this because we've got a problem here. There is no such thing as a distinction between private and public morality. The Christianity would teach you that both have to be in accord with one another. So we already have a problem with the premise. If the premise is faulty, then the foundation is faulty of your argument, then you're going to have subsequent problems building on top of that faulty argument. And then he continues, but also about public justice. Well, here's the thing, folks. You'll notice later on in the article, and we'll read it shortly, that he talks about if we were to follow Christ, we would have to institute mercy to the point where basically justice disappears. He doesn't say it that way, but that's what he implies in the article. This guy's not only all over the place, but more than anything else, and it's something that you and I spoke about before going live, it's evident that his writings bring forth what he truly is, and more than anything else, he seems to be a rabid leftist.
If you legislate mercy, is it really mercy? In other words, if I am commanded, if I am made to fear my government, that if I don't apply mercy, where they, the government, the people that run the show, tell me that I must apply mercy, then it's not really mercy. We're seeing situations like this where parents are being told what to do with their kids. And how does this apply to this? They're being merciful to our kids. We parents, we don't know how to create, how to multiply, how to form, shape. They teach us everything because anything and all things today are being taught. You really don't know how to do this. You don't know how to have a child, when to have a child. You're too old to have a child. You know nothing about rearing. You need all of us experts. It takes a village to show you all these things, including, if you listen to this guy, the legislation of mercy. You must show mercy here. And if you don't, then what happens? We will not be merciful with you.
Supposedly, that's the argument that he postulates in this article, right?
And so there are so many things about what Christ taught that today you go, wow, that sounds like a Christian doctrine. No, these things like mercy, love, you have to give them
right
out of your own free volition.
Correct.
If not, they're not really what Christ taught.
Exactly.
They're a fake, an imitation of that.
I'm glad you're harping on this point because that was going to be my next underlying point that I hope the audience keeps in mind as we continue to go through this article. He is an expert at missing the point in many of the texts that he is quoting that makes his case for him. And this is commonplace in many Christian circles. They'll extract certain verses, they'll extract certain texts, and they'll say, see, this proves my point. But when you read the context of where that verse is found, or you look at the spirit of that passage, it's another instance where, for example, he quotes Jesus and he talks about this man who was looking at his barns, he was looking at his fields. I think it's in Luke, if my mind doesn't fail me. It says, my soul, be rested. And Jesus says, your soul is being demanded of you this evening. He goes on to state that, you see, this is a problem if we were to basically base monetary policy off of what Jesus dictates. And that passage isn't even really dealing, as it were, with the love of money necessarily. It's dealing with basically not regarding God in anything.
Well, avarice is an issue. I think you and I are in agreement with that. But here's the thing about some of these Bible teachers. They will quote whatever parts of the verses or of a piece of sermon that Jesus pronounced or a teaching or something that Paul said. They will quote whatever is convenient so that to them it adds weight to their argument. But the reality of the fact is, if you go back to that piece of portion from the Bible, Jesus is talking about people that, while they are blessed, obviously, and they are getting increments, increase in their profitability, they omit God from their thoughts.
That's right.
And that was the problem with this individual. Avarice took over because there was no fear of God. God was never in his plans and his consideration.
Right.
And if you throw that into your argument, then you would have to be honest enough, if you're a Christian, and say, the problem is not that your wealth is multiplied. The problem is that whether you have a lot or barely enough to get by, if you omit God, that is your problem.
Well, to your point, then the broader point we're trying to make here is people like this, in order to make their point, or so they think, they'll take texts, they'll miss the point entirely of what that text is actually trying to communicate, and then they'll twist it. We talked recently about those that abuse the Bible, and by abuse the Bible, we mean those that will decontextualize things, misinterpret things intentionally to make false claims about what the Bible actually endorses. And this is no different, as you'll continue to notice. Now, I don't want the audience to dismiss how dismissive this guy is about basing public policy on what Christ teaches. Notice what he says next. It's a laughable thought, or maybe a dangerous one. I never thought I would hear or read, the day would arrive where I would hear a Christian say, basing public policy on what Christ taught is a dangerous move and even something that we need to mock.
How about if you move that to trying to run your affairs at home is a dangerous situation if you try to implement the teachings of Christ.
Right.
If you personally try to live in accordance to what Christ taught, that's an absurd idea. You really can't do that. So you can take it all the way from the individual to the family, to a city, a community, a school situation, a school board, whatever it is, nationwide, worldwide. And according to this guy, this is absurd and it would fail.
Isn't that necessarily then an endorsement? What he's endorsing is an idea then that we ought not take Christianity serious at all then?
Well, I'm going to run
I'm sorry to interrupt, because if we can't do it at the public level, then we can't do it at the individual level either.
So I'm going to run the risk of being called oversimplistic. Then how is the kingdom of God going to work?
Well, I'm glad.
I know what they're going to say. Well, sin will be out and the inclination to do the wrong thing will be out. And therefore, in that situation, Christianity can work. Well, it's true that we have the fallen nature. It's true that we still are surrounded by sinners. But the idea of implementing his will is so common and so, let's call it elementary to the Christian faith, that we are commanded to pray to God, what? Your kingdom come.
Exactly.
Thy will be done
on earth as it is in heaven.
And so at one point or another, you go like, is this guy high on something?
And it's rather interesting because
what is driving him?
I'm glad you're asking this, because then we go to Paul. And one of the things that Paul says that all Christians should do is to pray for those that are in positions of power, so that their hearts would be inclined toward God and do his will.
So many of the ideas that are implemented in, let's say, in the Western mentality, don't they come from the Bible?
They do. The people who wrote these constitutions all the way back to the Magna Carta and whatnot, Jonathan Edwards, those names come up during Britain, and then eventually the exportation of the Magna Carta and those ideas into the United States and whatnot. They all quoted back to the Bible.
And by writing the way he writes and opining the way he opines and sharing the way he shares, is he not enjoying Christian principles?
I'd like to mention this lest we forget, because this is a very important point, and you brought this up in a conversation as we were discussing the important points that we wanted to bring tonight for the audience. And I don't want to have this edition go by without mentioning it, because I think it's a really important point. The contrast. And you had mentioned this to me. So what he is saying, and this is, I'm paraphrasing what you told me. So he's saying that secularism and having secularism influence public policy is much preferable than having Christianity influence public policy.
Exactly.
This is absolutely absurd.
Yeah. For example, some of the things that he headlines or places on there, you cannot serve both God and money. And he's talking about when money isn't God. When you read this is a pastor that is actually pushing communism, which leads me to believe that this is the way he sees Jesus.
Well, yeah.
Because if you ask me, Joe, or if I ask you, hey, how about if we become a Christian nation? I think one of the first questions that would pop into your mind, I know definitely will pop into my mind, is what Jesus are we talking about? The Mormon Jesus?
Correct.
The Jehovah's Witnesses, a version of Jesus?
The communist Jesus? Because even Fidel Castro quoted Paul and he quoted Jesus, and of course decontextualized them.
And so I took the risk of oversimplifying. Now I can make this so complex that you would go, listen, I don't think I want to tackle the issue. But nevertheless, he goes on to present his case.
He continues, okay, this is the very first example, folks, of how he'll take a text, think that it proves his point when in fact it doesn't. Paul warned us, the cross is foolishness to the world. 1 Corinthians 1:18. By the cross, Paul is talking about the gospel. What does that have to do with Christianity influencing public policy? Again, there's no bridge that can tie one point to another, but he tries to give the impression that, in fact, the two shall meet. A crucified king, a kingdom where the first are last and the meek are blessed. You couldn't run a nation that way, not for long. I find it interesting because Jesus makes no bare bones about it. His kingdom is going to be run in the way that this guy says is laughable and destructive. At least the Bible tells us about this millennial kingdom where Jesus is going to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and everything that Jesus says is going to go because he's going to be the ruler.
So if Paul is arguing that what was common during the Roman Empire, which was crucifixion, people did not understand how God could bring justification, salvation to humanity be as something that when you looked at that, you go, wow, that is horrific, the way they apply capital punishment. If they didn't understand that, then it's not going to be understood. Now, should we throw our hands up in the air and say we give up, or do we continue to share Christ? And all of a sudden, just people like you and I, at one point, we're going like, what? To achieve forgiveness, Christ had to be crucified? That makes no sense. But as you preach the word of God and you develop all the themes that are behind this, and you go, well, that was the empire that was in place when Christ came to us. All of a sudden, it starts making sense.
Sure.
Where the opposite now happens. You go like, it's crazy for people to think that this is crazy.
Yeah.
And it's just by sharing the gospel. So again, I think to his own detriment and to his own failing, he starts arguing his ideas, and you go, the more he argues, the worse he makes it for himself.
Take that ditch. He continues, you couldn't run a nation that way, not for long, not without breaking it open. That language is interesting. What would happen if we treated Jesus not as a mascot for our theocratic or nationalist ambitions, but as the teacher and arbiter of our public life in the foolish, subversive kingdom of God way? What follows is not a policy proposal, it's a thought experiment, a way of asking what it might look like if a people decided to live, not just privately, but politically, as if the Sermon on the Mount were their constitution. Let's call it the Commonwealth of Christ. I will emphasize once again, folks, we're going to read other excerpts here to continue to prove the point that we're trying to make here. You'll notice that he makes it a point to intentionally miss the point so as to give the impression that the Bible endorses his idea and not the opposite. Under the subheading, when money isn't God, he quotes, as you were saying earlier, Matthew 6:24, you cannot serve both God and money. That's where Jesus mentions mammon, the God of riches. In Jesus' economy, value is not determined by productivity. Wealth is not a reward for effort or intelligence, and money is not neutral. It's a rival God capable of bending every policy, every institution, every heart towards self-interest and away from mercy. I am thinking that this guy thinks that Paul writes that money is the love of all evil. I think he's been listening to too much Pink Floyd. Gio, I don't get the joke. I'll read it again. And money is not neutral. It's a rival God, capable of bending every policy, so on and so forth. I thought Paul said that the love of money is the root of all evil. Some versions will read all kinds of evil. My understanding is
God
that
has
money,
no rival except in man's heart. And in your heart, you can decide God is worthless, he's weak, he's nothing. Does that make God worthless, weak, or nothing? No, it's an issue of the heart. And so to take that and say this will be part of public policy is not understanding what Jesus taught.
here's another point. When we're talking about money, or more specifically, the term that economists will use, currency, hasn't currencies, even from the time of Jesus till now, necessarily have changed? Because now we transfer digital assets or coins or numbers on a screen. It used to be paper dollars. It used to be gold coins, etc. There's the medium of exchange, as it were, could be different in differing types of economy. So the money itself is not evil. It's, to your point, what is in man's heart? What does he intend to do, as it were, through the acquisitions of these things? But his point, as it were, he thinks that Jesus is actually proving his point for him. He's actually contradicting Christ here.
So it doesn't really matter what kind of money was being used at any particular time. The Bible clearly teaches that a worker is worthy of his salary.
Yep.
So now we have a situation where a salary structure needs to be in place.
Right.
And if you implement that, whether it's gold, silver, paper, crypto,
Sheep, cattle.
if you do it with righteousness,
Right.
you implement a righteous, a just system, it works fine. Some people will develop more and get more than others. Why? Well, even to this day, we have argued this from the pulpit for so many years. Why should you get the same amount of return when you don't put forth the effort,
Correct.
when you really don't care about it?
That's right.
You see, some of the things that I said at the beginning of this program now come back and we need to visit them again. If you decide that you don't need to put forth the effort, that you can just get along and have the other people put the effort and you will reap the benefits, then at one point or another, I'm going to go, I'm tired of being used.
That's right.
I will no longer put forth my best effort, and everything then really goes to, pardon the French here a little bit, to the crapper.
Yeah.
But if the people are expecting something from me, they cannot go to their legislators and say, we demand of you that you demanded of them, because then it's no longer via love, it's no longer via mercy. So if you decide to place
Now
yourself,
it's enforced via dictate.
exactly, if you decide, I'm not going to put forth any effort, now you are at the mercy of what the people want to give you. Of course, the majority will say, we will take it from them by force by telling the legislators, hey, take it from them and bring it to us. And that way we will have implemented what Jesus taught. Jesus didn't teach such a thing.
I'm glad you're mentioning this, and some people might be asking, Gio, why do you smirk? Because what you just mentioned leads to something you mentioned earlier, that this guy is a closeted communist. Gio, can you prove this? We can prove it. We'll continue reading. Jesus told a story about a man whose land produced so much that he ran out of space. So he tore down his barns and built bigger ones, imagining an early retirement and a soul at ease. Then he kind of contextualizes Jesus's narrative here into something that has a 401k or whatnot. It's kind of interesting how he does that. By interesting, I mean it's foolish. Anyways, but God called him a fool. This very night your life is being demanded of you, Luke 12, verse 13 through 21. In the commonwealth of Christ, that story would become fiscal ethic. The goal wouldn't become economic growth, but shared sufficiency.
Shared sufficiency.
Isn't that another way of saying redistribution of wealth? It's the Marxist-Leninist language, right? The question would shift from
Comrade Marx would be proud.
he would. The question would shift from how much can we get to do our neighbors have enough? Folks, that is the typical presentation that communists will use to get you to buy into the idea that a free market isn't just.
So what if my neighbor doesn't have enough? Because again, I'll go back to the same
Whose
point.
fault is that? Is that your fault?
How about if my neighbor decides I'm not going to put forth any effort? Then it's not my problem. It's not even my concern if my neighbor doesn't have enough. What about if your neighbor is wicked, but his kids are lacking? Then you know what? I'll call the kids over, feed them, and say, tell your father and tell your mom who don't want to put forth any effort that your bellies are full because your neighbors fed you. But them, they are grown-ups. They are responsible. And tell them, since they call themselves Christians, that Paul said, if you don't work, you don't eat.
Some of you might be asking yourselves or might be asking us, Gio, Jesus, this guy might not know that his argument is actually going against his own beliefs, because he just earlier said that all of this would be destructive. And here he is almost painting in a negative light of sorts this whole idea of socialism. This is why I said earlier the internal contradictions are present.
But you know, I was going to say it at the beginning of the program, and I should have. I don't think this is born out of ignorance. I think there's malice behind this.
I agree. This is why I said earlier that one of the things that people like him will do is that they will deal, as it were, if we can use that, or they'll tolerate the internal contradiction so they have a scapegoat to say, I never said that. Look at what I said in this other part of the passage. I'll give you an example. In another part of the text, he talks about the importance of having open borders. He doesn't say it that way. He says, you see, the strangers, Israel had to accept the strangers, which, side note here, I'm going to interrupt myself. I thought that this thought experiment was based on the teachings of Jesus. Why does he kick it back to the Old Testament? And he does so in the article on a few occasions.
Absolutely.
Why does he kick it back to the Old Testament?
Including the Jubilee.
Right.
He kicks it back to that. Every 50 years that we're supposed to let the people go and forget the dead, and they didn't. Why are you kicking it back there?
I thought we were just basing this on Jesus' teachings.
Plus, Jesus himself criticized that other
right.
system.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Going back to my original point. He
well,
says,
if he didn't criticize the system, at least he criticized and he pointed out the fact that even though it had a good intention, the corrupt nature in man did not allow them to follow that with the intent that God had. And if that is still around and we're not implementing Christian thought in this supposed world that we are not supposed to create, or a nation that we are not supposed to create, then it won't work here either.
Exactly. Well, then think about it, folks. At one point in the article, he says we need to open the doors to be hospitable and compassionate to the strangers, because God commanded Israel to be compassionate because they were strangers once in Egypt and they had to accept strangers. Notice that there's a lot attached to that whole idea. that for another day. Even
So
though
we
talked
want
about
his
it before.
address so we can send some people his way.
Well, specifically the MS-13 kind. We would like to send a few of those
Some
guys
Tren de
over.
Aragua.
Yes,
Yes,
exactly. Yeah.
absolutely.
Transnational narco
send us
gangs.
your address so we
Exactly.
can get some people over.
Show them the love of Christ.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
On a shorter scale, because obviously on a nationwide scale, which you are complaining about, it wouldn't work.
Well, and then here's the point. 2 sentences later, after he's making this argument, he says, we need to actually defend our borders. This is my point earlier. These people are mealy-mouthed intentionally, so that if you accuse them of what you rightfully should be accusing them of, they'll say, I never said that. Read that part of the article. It's still an internal contradiction. Listen to this, folks. He continues, the goal wouldn't become economic growth, but shared sufficiency. The question would shift from how much can we get to do our neighbors have enough? And that's where the foolishness starts. Such an economy would violate nearly every tenet of modern financial orthodoxy. Side note, what we have in the United States is not a true free market. It's actually socialistic, especially with the recent moves that Trump has made where he wants to nationalize. He talked about earning the federal government, I think it actually happened, 10% stake in Intel. And now Lutnick is out there saying that they want to nationalize the defense industry.
School is a socialist system.
Right.
Health is a socialist system.
right.
Shall we continue?
Private property. There is no such thing in this country as private property. That's not true, Gio. It says in my deed, the fact that you have to pay taxes to the local municipality for that property means that you don't own your property. Guess who owns it? The government. You just rent from them.
Go ahead and don't pay your taxes for the next 2 years and see what happens.
I had never thought about that. We're irrespective. You're welcome for opening your perspective here. He continues, it would challenge the belief that those who work the hardest deserve the most.
I told you.
Interesting. It
Conrad Marx. They would like him.
It would remember uncomfortably that the land belongs to God and we are the tenants, not owners. Oh, in ancient Israel, every 50 years, debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land was returned. Little secret, that's a lie. The landowners, they continued to own the land. The thing is that people had to sell their parcels of land, as it were, to have their debts forgiven. He doesn't tell you that aspect, but I'm just giving you that little history lesson that's available to you if you read the Bible.
And the really nice Israelis, when it was around year 47, they said, we're not going to be lending any money
That's right.
until we get back to year 1. Otherwise, in 3 years,
No
we
return on
get
investment.
very little return, so it's not going to happen.
That's right. This was Jubilee, not Utopia, a sacred recalibration. In the early church, the spirit persisted. There was not a needy person among them. Acts 4:34. Gio, but doesn't that necessarily antagonize what you said earlier about him pointing to Israel? I would encourage you to read, and I'm speaking into the mic a little more to make the emphasis more proper. Read the rest of that chapter and see what ended up happening when the church started sharing in all things. It didn't end up well.
Paul has to tackle issues like, why aren't you feeding grandma? And where are the kids? Because I'm talking to the grandkids. Where are the kids? Why aren't you feeding mom? She's not a widow. She's never really been in Christian service. What is wrong with you? Why are you putting the burden on the church? Because that doctrine has been around forever. We should not have any kind of a social net for the needy born out of love, because the church should be tackling all these things. They already tried it.
And it failed.
And it failed.
Yep.
Is this why the book of Acts points this out precisely?
Exactly.
The thing is that these preachers, they're very astute. They'll go to these verses and they won't tell you why this shows up in the Bible. And on many occasions, some of these experiments, some of these things that they did by themselves and not by the leading of the Holy Spirit are left in the Bible, so you can see the end result of being led by yourself, even though you're calling it, I'm being led by the Holy Spirit. You see the end result of human ideas, and they fail miserably.
It's kind of curious. The Pilgrims, when they arrived in Massachusetts, Plymouth Colony, that's eventually what they call
And
it.
Elizabeth Warren was there to greet them.
Yes, she was. Yes, she was there to greet them. And Elon Omar with her $30 million that she had stashed away somewhere. Interestingly enough, they tried this experiment of no private property. We're all going to share in the land. Well, guess what happened? About 6 months after the experiment started, they said, you know, this thing of not having private property is really bad because there's a couple of people in our colony here that, what shall we call them? They tend to lean on the efforts of other people and not put forth the full effort that is needed, as it were.
We all have family members that colonize our freezers.
That's right. That's right.
And our pantries.
Absolutely. he finishes this area. I told you the article is going to be long enough. We weren't going to read the whole, but you get the gist of it. This wasn't socialism, he writes. It was resurrection economics. The euphemisms, man. This is just it's what happens when the community of the crucified refuses to let mammon make the rules. Imagine a system where housing is treated as a human need and not a market bet, where wages are enough to live on, where those with surplus share. Now, how would that sharing go down in a communist system? Isn't it? We're going to take it
Your
from
fair
you from
share,
by force.
according to Obama, is you got to pay your fair share, which in
Correct.
some cases has people paying 90% and others paying 0.
And he doesn't pay anything, and he gets to live in Martha's Vineyard.
But that's fair
That's fair.
in their mind.
Correct. Not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. Interesting. It wouldn't be efficient. It
I
wouldn't
don't
be
have any
clean.
guilt.
Exactly.
Even if I don't share it with this guy, I'm still not going to feel guilty.
And try to comfort and see what happens. Some would exploit it. The GDP might shrink. The system might fail, but it would fail in the direction of grace. So at the beginning of the article, he thinks that he is taking a shot at the Christian nationalist, and subversively, he's putting in language that would say, you know, if we actually interpret it in this communistic Jesus fashion, it would actually be better for us. You see, folks, one of the reasons that we take the time to read these things,
Send him to the gulag.
comrade, comrade, off to the gulag you go.
In
Folks,
Gorky Park.
one of the reasons that we take the time to read these things, see you, and I will emphasize it over and over again. We will continue to emphasize it. One of the reasons that we have decided to break away from the traditionalist way of engaging in Christian teaching is because in many instances it's actually ineffective. And I'll tell you why. Wait a minute. Reading from the Bible is ineffective? That is not at all what I said. Allow me to explain myself. When you make Bible reading a ritualistic thing and don't look to see what the practical applications are for what the Bible is attempting to teach you, and you go to church every single Sunday and you listen to the 45-minute sermon and you say, Pastor, that was a great preaching, and you take nothing from it, especially with modern day pastors that they're not even there to actually teach you the word of God. They're just there to assuage your pride. They call it moral deistic therapeutic-ism, as it were, or another thing. In essence, they're there to assuage your pride and to say, you know, Jesus loves you and he's okay with the way that you are, et cetera, et cetera. That is not what Christianity is about. You made this clear very many years ago. Jesus told the 12, follow me. He modeled for them the way they walked, figuratively and literally speaking. He taught them how to do things. They went and replicated that. They had disciples of their own. They replicated themselves and those disciples, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we want to break away from, we've said it over and over again with Irrespective, is conventional Christianity, because we notice that it's ineffective because it doesn't follow the Christian model of these things. That's why we will take time to break away from that model. We'll go to the articles. We'll go to their sayings. We will show you line by line where the discrepancies, the contradictions, the misinterpretations, the malice, you were using the word earlier, and it's a proper one, the malice that underlines their arguments are to get you to believe in something that is actually contradictory to biblical ethics, and replace that with a proper understanding that will free you from this sort of chicanery.
Jesus was so clear on everything that all we have to do is rid ourselves, detox from the teachings that the pulpit has brought into the mind and into the soul, and we will see things clearly. You know how many times I've heard over the years, hey, they were following Jesus because he was providing bread and fish. And it's true. It's true. Once Jesus said, I've had enough of the multiplication here, what came into the picture?
No more welfare.
The subtraction. They started leaving to the point that you ask
give me
yourself,
free food anymore? What's going on here?
well, you ask yourself, where were all these people that were blessed by his ministry at
know
the
where you're
end
going.
when he was
I know
crucified?
where you're going, yep.
Why weren't they shouting, wait a minute, he fed us.
Yep.
He healed us. You see, you can have avarice show up on the scene and it will masquerade itself. It will present itself with such craftiness that if you're not paying attention, you will say, boy, that is some deep level of spirituality right there. They were following Jesus.
Yeah.
3 days. Jesus said, I feel sorry for these people that haven't had a bite to eat, so I'll feed them. What are they thinking? You know, the journey was worth it because at the end of the day, we've seen signs and miracles, and No, they moved away from that and they went, wait a minute.
This is like a Meals on Wheels.
Exactly. I think if we follow him long enough, we can get him to do this on a daily basis, not just every 3 days.
That's right.
The 3 days is a long time, but we did put up with it, and he multiplied those fish and the bread. I think we can get him to do this every day and a half, every day. Next thing you know, we have 3 squares.
That's right. That's right.
And all we have to do is glory to God.
So I don't have to go out to the sea anymore or to the local pond and get the fish anymore. Now he provides it for me by just showing up. This is great.
Furthermore, I shall take a few extra loaves.
Exactly.
And I will go back to my village. I will return, Jesus. I will be back here to follow you tomorrow. And I'll sell these.
That's right. For a nice profit.
Because at the end of the day, I had the task of following him. It was difficult following him around. I got tired of those sermons. But anyway, I took a few extra
Well,
loaves.
it is heavy to
and
carry
some-
those baskets
and
around.
I need to net a profit here and I will tithe out of from that. You can see human nature kicking in into all this,
I
right?
could even see a person approaching Jesus. Jesus, you know I love you, right? Could you stop making white bread? Could you make sourdough?
I would like some marble rye.
That's right.
Why is this not toasted? And where is the butter?
Jesus, don't you understand that I have a problem with gluten inflammation? Jesus. Folks, we hope that not only has this been entertaining, but also uplifting and in a sense informative also. That we try to, give you moments where you can laugh with us also, because these things need to be mocked, but also to give you a cleared eye view of what it is that they're trying to get you to buy into. Don't fall for it. Please don't fall for the arguments. Be careful. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Notice the use of euphemisms. Notice the use of internal contradictions. Notice the use of decontextualized verses. And well, last but not least, sanctimony. They package it in a way to present it to you as this is the proper way that we deploy Christianity, when in fact it's actually antithetical to biblical Christianity.
So, Gio, honestly, I have a sincere question. If a Christian nation just would not work,
Mhm.
what can we say about an anti-Christian nation?
We don't need to go far. We're seeing it.
'Cause, what are the choices? A Christian nation,
Right.
A neutral nation,
Which
and
that
a-
doesn't exist.
and an anti-Christian nation.
There's no such thing as a neutral nation. You're going to have to choose. Either you choose Christ or you choose against him. There is no other way about it, Folks, that's what we have for you on this edition of Irrespective. Do not forget that we will stream again on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next edition of Irrespective. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell if you're on YouTube. Also, give us
Ding,
a
ding,
thumbs
ding,
up.
ding, ding.
Ding, 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 ding. Remember to give us a thumbs up no matter where you're watching, whether it is on X, whether it is on Rumble, whether it is on YouTube. Algorithms. The more organic interest there is in the content, the more they're beginning to share our stuff. Please do so. Last but not least, do not forget to donate. It helps us to continue to put out this content for your edification. Links for everything we've just mentioned are beneath the video player, wherever it is that you're watching this. That's all for now. We hope that you had a good evening with us, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. Until the next occasion that we gather,